Righto. I think I should simply ask Stephen Hockman to begin, please.
Don't worry. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Ladies and gentlemen, from the enthusiasm which people are seizing these bottles, one might assume that something other than water was contained in them. But maybe not. Well, I think it was Winston Churchill, very early in the course of the Second World War, who said, well, I certainly can't say that we have reached the beginning of the end, but this may at least be the end of the beginning. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can be reasonably confident that this is the beginning of the end. And that's why I'm smiling, yes. And you're smiling all the more. For reasons best known to the organizers and certainly wholly unknown to me, I have been invited to start the session entitled The Beginning of the End. And I'll be followed, I think, by Emilios, and then it will be over to you to bring that to a conclusion. So precisely when we finish will be largely up to you. But let me begin, if I may, not only by repeating how great the whole thing has been, which we've all agreed upon. Maybe the one thing we've all agreed upon is how good it is to enable us to hear the sound of our own voices. But let me say that, and I want to say a word or two about governance, and I want to say a word or two about the role of judges within that context. But in doing so, I am, I think, to a limited extent going to be repeating what I said first thing this morning, but addressing myself particularly to what I thought was a very powerful intervention by Professor Varoufakis, who reminded us that these questions are not only complex in themselves, but we cannot assume that in the world out there will be the same degree of consensus about the objectives as there has been in this room. You know, in this room we are all in favor of addressing these problems, of overcoming climate change, of addressing the problems of poverty and famine and so on. But there are people out there who, surprising though it may seem, don't actually care much about those objectives. And their objectives are different. Their objectives are entirely selfish. This is not to say that they are behaving unlawfully. If they were behaving unlawfully, at least under the current law, then maybe we could do something about it. But there are certainly people out there who whose motives are less than positive, and these are perhaps the people who Professor Ashford would say we need to move out of the way. Maybe we need to do something a little more drastic in order to overcome those problems. So it comes back to the question with which we started the day: how do we achieve our objectives? And as I say, my own personal answers, by no means comprehensive, but my own personal answers to that question run along the following lines. First of all, I agree that morality has a part to play, and we have been treated to a number of contributions on that subject, particularly from our resident political philosopher, and I wouldn't dream of attempting to go into that subject, although I was interested in the idea that you can have an ethical duty not just to be nice to your neighbor, not to steal from your neighbor, even if you're a university professor, but that you have an ethical duty to ensure that appropriate institutions of governance are in place. That, I thought, was an interesting idea which we should take note of. But I don't really want to pursue the path of ethics in too much detail, because it seems to me that in the end these are really political problems, that it is a question of the systems of governance that we are able to put in place. And to use the phrase that I used first thing this morning, it is a question of the nature and strength of the institutions that we can create in order to solve these problems. The 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 billion people cannot simply by declaring what the solutions need to be hope to bring about a solution. Even though it is, as Annabelle also said, a question of will. Nonetheless, to will the solutions is not enough. That the mechanism for the solution has to be, it seems to me at least, the creation of the necessary institutions. And that means entrusting the solution into the hands of a much smaller number of people. A particular example of this is in the climate change discussions themselves, which have shown how difficult it is for the nations of the world gathered together on a one country, one vote basis to arrive at a consensus. That international legal order has shown itself to be flawed. I wouldn't entirely rule out the possibility of a longer-term solution, but it is going to be fantastically difficult unless we can arrive at a better institutional structure for the resolution of those problems. And so it seems to me that we do need new institutions. I believe we need, although I am not a financial expert or an economist, but I believe we need new international financial institutions. By the way, one of the reasons why we need that, again to go back to something Annabelle said, is the extraordinary ignorance among the population at large as to these problems. Although the G20 have been working on this, and although there is, I believe, something called the Basel Agreement, which helps to regulate financial structures better than before, who knows what that really means? All we know is that we nearly lost, those of us who were lucky enough to have any savings in the banks, we nearly lost them overnight. Our previous Chancellor of the Exchequer said the other day at a conference in Manchester, of all places, that the British bank system was within 2 hours of collapse in 2008. And for those of us, as I say, who had a modest amount of savings in the banks, that was not a comfortable thing to hear. And, you know, if that was our predicament, the predicament of I'm sure must be the same or even greater. So if there are solutions ongoing, we need to know what they are. And my own belief is that until we have better systems of governance, better institutions, which can also be transparent, we will not arrive at those solutions. But, and let me add this caveat before moving to my second and final point, I think we also need to recognize, and here I part company slightly, I think, with the emphasis of some people in the room, including my hero, Professor Varoufakis. I think we need to recognize that the solutions will not necessarily be absolute, that all of these policy problems are likely to involve striking some sort of balance. I share the distaste for the excesses of capitalism. I share the horror at the way some people in the financial world and some people in the banks have behaved in enhancing the paper value of transactions so that their own resources linked to the paper value of those transactions by percentages could be increased regardless of the inevitable result, that the paper value would eventually be seen to be entirely different from the real value of the underlying transaction. We can all be anxious about these things, but the problem is that simply to switch from that position to a situation in which there is a vast amount of regulation, thereby in itself undermining confidence in the financial system, is not the solution. We depend on the financial system, we depend on business, we depend, unfortunately, some might think, on people making a profit. If we are to have the resources to solve some of these problems, the technological solutions that some people have called for, carbon capture and storage, although I know some people don't think this is the answer, but carbon capture and storage, which many people believe is going to make an enormous contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, depends on investment. The problem that we have in the UK at the moment is how to achieve the necessary degree of regulation without stifling investment. How do you generate the resources which have to come ultimately from private capital to enable these problems to be solved without, as it were, handing over the whole discussion to the private sector? So these are not easy, even though you need stronger institutions, and even though, as I said at the beginning, information technology in particular ought to enable one to have stronger and more transparent institutions, the problems will still be nuanced. The problems will still be still involve striking a balance. Now, allow me please another 2 or 3 minutes on the judicial side of governance, because I think here is an area where there has not perhaps been enough concentration, and one or two of the things I want to say, again most briefly, I fear will shock my legal colleague, Professor Christie, but I have to say them nonetheless. He's looking at me with a very severe, I feel slightly like one of his undergraduate students at the moment, and I think I'm going to get severely marked down, but I'm going to go ahead nevertheless. And I want to make 2 very brief points which may surprise people slightly. First of all, I think we, contrary to what I think may have been suggested earlier, I think that we are increasingly seeing a role for the courts in putting the flesh on the bones of general obligations. This has not historically been a task that the judges have readily accepted. The judges in the past, I think all over the world, certainly in the UK and in the United States, have expected to be told, if possible in the greatest detail, what the law is, so that they can simply apply it to the facts of a particular case. But increasingly we are discovering that when you ask the judges, especially at a Supreme Court level, we have Supreme Courts in the UK, in the United States, in India, in other places. I understand in Greece you have a Conseil Administratif, if I've got the phrase right, which has been doing some very valuable work indeed. And I think increasingly we are seeing that the European Court of Human Rights is another very good example. We're seeing that concepts which have to be expressed in general terms can then be made more specific in their application to particular cases by the judges. And this is particularly relevant when you remember that in our sophisticated society, some of these problems do involve that balance that I was talking about. It's impossible to legislate completely to strike that balance. You need a tribunal of experienced judges. They probably need to be much better qualified in scientific issues, or at least much better informed and educated as to scientific issues than ever before.